record intros separately to this, so we'll just dive into conversation. So, David Gushee, welcome to the Liminal Living Podcast. It's wonderful to have you on here today.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate the invitation very much.
Well, I appreciate you saying yes. We have a mutual friend, Danny Cox, and he just had you in for the Open Table Collective, and I saw the title of your book, and I immediately kind of reached out and said, I need to have a conversation with this guy. So I really appreciate you saying yes and carving out an hour of your day to come talk with me and my listeners today.
Well, I'm very pleased, and Danny is one of my favorite pastors in America, so it's always glad to be with a mutual friend, so that's awesome, yeah.
Oh, that's great. I just met Danny, and he's going to be coming on the show in a couple of weeks as well, so it's going to be, it's going to be good. I'm looking forward to talking with him, looking forward to talking with you. I went on your website, and I was reading, your resume, and I was just like, holy cow, you have like the amount of books and articles and teaching positions and chair positions. I mean, you just have this massive, impressive resume. I'm going to go over all of that in a recorded introduction, but what kind of soil did your life grow out of to bring you to this place, and what role did faith play in that?
Well, thank you for the kind words, Tom. I can't say that I fully understand or can even claim ownership of the journey, I think that looking back from a certain distance, I can see lots of grace and lots of good fortune and some turns in the road that were very fortunate that not everybody around me enjoyed, But in terms of my backstory, I was blessed with loving parents. I grew up in the Northern Virginia area. My father was a policy analyst for the federal government. My mother had less education, but she was the heartbeat of our family. I was raised Catholic. Dad wasn't cooperative. Mom had to drag the four of us to church during my childhood. I was the oldest of four. She would say that I had a spiritual and certainly an emotional depth, maybe unusual for a young boy in the 1960s. So I was hungry for connection, for meaning, for love, for God, though I didn't give the Catholic Church much of a chance to help me meet God. I think I threw it out along with my adolescent rebellion, was just kind of all in there together. But it was when I took some setbacks as a high schooler, my first love breaking up, my athletic dreams collapsing, my rather fragile psychology hitting the skids, that my hunger for meaning and for an organizing center to my psychology, to my spirit, made me ready when I wandered into a Southern Baptist church uninvited on a Friday afternoon in the year that I turned 16, and 4 days later had a born-again experience and became a convert, a born-again Christian as a 16-year-old. And as I look back, I talk about this in my memoir called Still Christian, which I wrote about 5 years ago, a little longer than that now, 7 years ago. I think that without a conversion experience and then a church that knew what to do with a new convert, I might have been rather a mess as an adult. Because high emotions, emotional fragility, easily hurt. I think that my emotional weakness in that sense might have overwhelmed whatever gifts or strengths that I had. But my faith in Christ anchored me. It gave me a sense of purpose. It gave me a sense of direction. It gave me a community. It gave me a narrative. And it got me launched as a young adult. After that, I was able to have the stability to pursue other goals and to have my academic abilities blossom, and to have romantic relationships ultimately culminating in my marriage after college that had some stability and quality to them. So I would say I was rescued as a 16-year-old, and it set an anchor point in my life that never ended, never went away. And after that, kind of some of the gifts of my background and my sense of interest in the world and desire to make a positive difference were able to take off.
I like how you kind of frame that with a fragile psychology needing that anchor point and the conversion kind of giving that to you. And I can really see that in my own story looking back. You know, we tend to need something to push against. Richard Rohr says, you know, you push against where you were to kind of grow and mature. And I've never really, in conversations with, you know, other people who've gone through deconstruction or rethinking their faith, there tends to be like a demonizing of the previous thing that you pushed against. And I like how you framed that, because you honor what it was, and yet you still grew forward and grew into a different place. Was there a moment when you really had to rethink some things, maybe done a deconstruction of something, and what did that look like?
There have been several. So people who know my work very well in the last 10 years may find it hard to believe that for at least 6 years, 7 years, 8 years, I was a Southern Baptist. I mean, I was legit Southern Baptist through and through. I was, you know, reading the King James Bible and the Living Bible. That was what I was given. I was trying to evangelize my friends. I was shocked when people used profanity around me. You know, I was that kid. You know, I was reading the Bible every day. I remember a pivotal experience my freshman year where a young lady was having major emotional problems, and I talked with her about them, and then I tried to lead her in an evangelistic experience, which she said yes to at the moment. And then she came back to me and she said, you know, I was upset, and I actually, as I look back on our conversation, I think that was not a legitimate thing that you did. You took advantage of me being upset, and
Wow.
and that was not a real conversion. I take it back.
Oh, wow.
That was just 2 years after I had become a born-again Southern Baptist Christian. But what I honor about that experience was all the things I've mentioned: organizing Center for Personality, a meaningful narrative, a picture of a God who loved me and loved everyone, a Jesus who sacrificed his life for me, a purpose in relating to all other people, a moral code, a way of looking at the world that made sense in a lot of ways. All of that was good. Now, as I look back on it, I'm more aware now than I was then of the blind spots of that world. They had not dealt with social justice issues at all. They had not dealt with race in the history of Southern Baptist life. It was a patriarchal world, though not entirely, not as much as SBC is now in a lot of ways. But anyway, that world was good to me, but deconstructions happened in various stages. I went to Southern Baptist Seminary after I went to William & Mary. I majored in religion. Then I went to Southern Seminary, fully pursuing that dream that had come to me within 1 year of my conversion, which was to train to be a Southern Baptist pastor. So I did go to Southern Baptist Seminary. I served as a youth minister. I eventually got ordained. I am an ordained pastor from a Southern Baptist background. But my landscape broadened when I took Christian ethics with Paul Simmons and Glenn Stassen, and I saw that the Christian faith is about the world's problems, not just personal stuff, and that the church has something to say on issues like race and environment and economics, and not just like sexuality and drinking and cursing, right?
Yeah.
And by the time I was done with seminary, I had been immersed, full immersion in the Southern Baptist world for 9 years, and I was ready for a very big change. And so my wife and I moved to New York City, and I went to Union Seminary in New York, which, if anybody knows anything about that school, it's the liberal, radical end of the Protestant spectrum. Was then, is now. And so my doors were blown off when we moved to New York, Upper West Side, and I started taking classes with liberation theologians and going to school with LGBT classmates and encountering serious feminist theology and ethics, encountering global liberationist Christianity from the global South, Asia, Africa, Latin America. And my cramped little white guy Southern Baptist vision was very much challenged. And also, I did a dissertation on the Holocaust. It was the early 90s. There was a lot of attention to the Holocaust at that time, and I had always been interested. And so reading about that level of evil and writing about that tiny minority of Christians who rescued Jews during the Holocaust, less than 1%, less than 1/10 of 1% of Christians. It set a moral direction for me, gave me a more global vision, and still, by the time I graduated from Union, I would still have identified as you might call me a progressive evangelical Christian. Influences included a man that I worked with named Ron Sider, who wrote Rich Christians in an Age of Hunger. I worked with him for 2.5 years in Philadelphia. Tony Campolo, Jim Wallace of Sojourners, they were mentors, and I became one of those kinds of evangelicals, right? And I started my teaching career back at Southern Baptist Seminary as a center-left evangelical, and I was able to preserve that identity with challenges for about 20 years. But then when I felt led to tackle the LGBT inclusion question in 2014 in a book called Changing Our Mind, I deconstructed the traditionalist perspective step by step in public, in print, and after that, everything blew up. My associational life blew up, my friendships blew up, my ministry blew up, and my perspective changed. And a lot of people only encountered me after that. After I became an exile from the evangelical world, moved into post-evangelical space, liminal space for a while, because there wasn't a thing called post-evangelicalism really when I wrote Changing Our Mind. And so I had what you might say maybe 5 years of exile space, out of one world, not really in another one. And but since about 2018, 2019, I've been writing about and living in this new thing being born called post-evangelicalism. So I feel less liminal and more at home than I have in a while.
We had Zach Lambert on the show a couple months ago.
Dear Zach. Yep.
Yeah.
My dear friend. Love that man.
He was a phenomenal person. He's so intelligent. It was such a good conversation. Now, in that space, you started to probably think politically. I mean, it's 2 years before, 2016, when, those elections are taking place. And you most recently have written a book with like a smoking hot title. I guess I just got to say, his smoking hot title, Defending Democracy from Its Christian Enemies. What kind of responses are you getting to this work?
The thesis of the book is that democracy, that is the rule of the people under the rule of law, our constitutional order, needs defending. It needs articulating what exactly is democracy and defending its principles from a certain group of right-wing Christians in the U.S., but the book has comparisons with 7 countries, and so it's not just a U.S. issue. But it needs defending from right-wing Christians who are willing to embrace authoritarian rule, autocracy, in the name of Christian values. And the reason they're willing to embrace autocracy is because they do not trust that democracy will yield the kind of religious and moral landscape and legal landscape in their countries that they want. And if the people are going to vote for things like gay marriage and abortion and no-fault divorce, then they are interested in finding somebody who will seize control of the government and mandate that the values that they hold are the values of the country and the law of the land. And that's what makes them Christian enemies of democracy.
I can definitely see that. I've been having lots of conversations trying. You get those like intuitions, and then you need to find words for those intuitions. And I've been having these intuitions since 2016, and just trying to really solidify, like, how do I have these conversations with people when everything is like so trigger thin of a membrane before you're into outrage and offense?
Yeah.
How would you define democracy and like the key mechanisms that are there? Let's like start from base one, and just give us your running definition of how democracy is supposed to work and what it is.
I'm happy to do it. By the way, this book comes out of deep background for me. My father did work for the federal government, and so we talked about government and how it functioned. We lived near Washington.
Yeah.
I knew a lot of people who served in both elected and civil service offices, and so that's home folks for me, right? And I've also written a lot about faith and politics. And by studying Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, I was able to study up close the collapse of a democratic system in favor of a dictatorship. I mean, there was a democracy. It was struggling from the beginning, but there was a democracy in Germany, a parliamentary system that the Nazis took apart brick by brick as soon as they got power.
Yeah.
So I know a lot about this. The way I describe democracy as a tradition that has developed over the last 400 years, though there are precedents that go back a lot further. A tradition based on a certain set of core principles. One of them is that the government should belong to the people, not to one person or family, or not to an oligarchy, say, of the rich or the nobles or something, right? Or not to a dictator like Putin or the Kim Jong-un family in North Korea or something. That the government belongs to the people. The people agree to write a constitution which will set the basic rules of how the country will operate and how the government will operate. That's the first act, you might say, of a democracy, is to write a constitution. And then, you have to elect representatives to write that constitution. And so, but after that, you have a system set up for the continual election of representatives to represent the will of the people. So a democracy looks like popular sovereignty constrained by a constitution which sets up mechanisms for the transfer of power and for elections, and which separates power so that it's not able to be concentrated in one hand. So in our system, we have the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judiciary, which reviews the laws. We also have a federal system where we have multiple levels of power: national, state, county, local. There's a genius here that because people want to concentrate power, and the more power is concentrated, the more risk there is of losing a democracy, then you have to diffuse and break up power into multiple levels. You have to have regular elections so that people cannot hold on to power forever, and if they're not doing well, they can be voted out. A democracy also involves certain connected norms, like you have to have a rights charter to protect individuals and minorities from the whim of the majority that might like to persecute them or attack them. So if you have an unpopular opinion in the U.S., you can't just be thrown in jail for it. So you have to have rights that protect individuals. Or if you have an unpopular religion, you can't be stamped out by the state, right? So you need a package of rights, and our Bill of Rights does that. You need a judiciary that sets limits on what the legislature and the executive does, but you also need all of the branches checking each other. You need elections that are free, fair, and transparent. You need the losers being willing to give up power if they lose, and to concede elections graciously if they lose. You need all the passions of politics channeled into the electoral process and not spilling onto violence against people we disagree with. And you need a free press with multiple perspectives to be a watchdog over the whole process. These are elements that it's good to articulate all of them, because we often don't. And they can all be weakened by people who want to take over control of the government for themselves. So what happens when somebody wants to take over the government for themselves? They maybe abolish or rig elections. They intimidate political opponents with threats of violence or actual violence. They suppress the media or target journalists. They hamstring the judiciary or destroy its independence. If Putin wants somebody put in jail in Russia, that person's going to be in jail. That means though they have the appearance of a judiciary, it's not an independent judiciary, right? If Putin wants somebody dead, they're going to die. And nobody's going to stop him. That's the difference between an autocracy and a democracy with rule of law. The thing about a democracy, though, is that sometimes you and millions of people may be completely convinced that something is right, but it doesn't happen. Or completely convinced that something is wrong, and it does happen. So in a democracy, you can lose. And lose, and lose, and lose, and lose. And you agree to continue to play by the rules of the democracy even if you keep losing.
Okay.
The problem with a certain kind of religious or ideological mindset can be, it is wrong for us to lose because we hold the truth, capital T. We are right. We know that, for example, abortion is against God's law. Or we know that homosexuality is against God's law. Therefore, any law that allows either of those things is against God's law. Now, what can happen is if people are convinced of that, they can attack LGBT people, or they can attack abortion clinics or whatever. But what we're talking about now is not lone wolf like terrorists. What we're talking about is a population that is willing to set aside or weaken democracy through the various shenanigans that people like Viktor Orban in Hungary, or Putin in Russia, or Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, or Trump have attempted. For example, refusing to concede elections, impeding the peaceful transfer of power, threatening violence, and attempting to interrupt the electoral count on January 6th. That's why what I'm trying to say is it's not partisan. If a Democrat were to do those things, they would be just as subject to my criticism as a Republican. In any country, any political party or figure who messes with the mechanisms of democracy, which are sacred to the functioning of democracy, has to be criticized.
So,
yeah, I'm a big sports fan, so let me just give you, I think I mentioned earlier, I wanted to be a professional athlete. My goal was to be a professional baseball player.
okay.
So, there are various strategies for winning a baseball game, but you can't have a baseball game if you can't agree on the rules. Then you need umpires who offer the fair enforcement of the rules without bias or partiality. People who are messing with democracy, it's like they're messing with the game itself. You might say the umpires not being fair, like people say who will not count the ballots if the ballots are giving the results that they don't want, or not certify elections. Or, like when a baseball game ends because one team has more runs than the other team recognizes it has lost, and they leave the field. It's over. You can't have any game without agreed rules fairly enforced. You can't have a democracy without agreed rules fairly enforced and accepted by all.
I like that illustration of the baseball and the kind of like the scaffolding of the rules. This is how we play this game, and then saying that's like democracy is not the coach or the players or the teams, but the actual rule of how we're going to play this game. That's helpful.
And we've all agreed on those rules, and we've all agreed to deal with the implications of those rules.
Yeah.
So imagine a baseball player who has swung and missed 3 times. That's a strikeout, but they refuse to go sit down.
Mm-hmm.
I want more. Because I'm so special, I get to have 6 swings, not just 3. You don't get to do that, and the umpire sends you back to the bench if you don't go, right? It's that kind of thing. We agree on the rules, and we agree to be bound by the rules. The other thing also is that there are norms that go with it, like, for example, the norm of not harassing or pressuring election officials, the people who run elections. They should be independent, civilian, nonpartisan people who just stand there at the polls and help people vote, and the people who count them later. If you manipulate that fragile process, you can destroy a democracy. But you can see how people could get to a certain place where they're so inflamed with fear or hatred of the other side, or so fired up about the righteousness of their cause that they would say, well, the rules are nice, but it's more important that goodness prevails.
So I'm starting to see some correlations here, with the authoritarianism that is on the rise with the conservative right, that Christians seem to be like really drawn to, seems to be stemming from a place of this: the majority is not doing it right, so therefore we cannot let the majority rule us any longer.
Yeah.
Because they're, and then we get that whole Project 2025, like we need to set up a system in which the majority does not rule, but we get to rule because we have the capital T truth on how things ought to be.
That's pretty much right. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then Christians, so that's why we're defending democracy from the Christian enemies, because, we're like drawn to these authoritarian figures.
In the book, I reflect on, well, where does this authoritarianism come from for us? And those of us who have enough experience with church life on the fundamentalist or evangelical sector, Catholic too, for that matter, sometimes Orthodox as well, there's a lot of authoritarianism in the history of Christianity.
Yeah.
There's a lot of authoritarianism in the practice of Christianity even today.
Yeah.
It wasn't the tradition, like even in my Southern Baptist church, we didn't act as if the pastor was a god or something, but there are a lot of churches Protestant churches in which the pastor is kind of an unquestioned patriarch, which is one reason why you have so much abuse of power in churches where the pastor is a godlike figure who cannot be challenged.
Yeah.
Right? And you had ideologies about parenting that were taught in many churches where, the father is something like that unquestionable patriarch.
Yep.
God appointed this man to be the head of this household, and everybody else's role is to submit. And so, in the more hierarchical denominations like the Catholic Church, where it goes up a ladder, priest, bishop, cardinal, pope, right? You have an official magisterium and somebody at the top, but if you study Catholicism closely, there are various mechanisms to check even a pope. But it's a hierarchical system, and the more high up the ladder you go, the more power there is, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's authoritarianism in Christianity, and if you look at the origins of early democracy in the 16th and 17th century and 18th century, a lot of Christians had to be persuaded that even if their religious tradition was authoritarian, they should embrace a non-authoritarian politics. So you might submit to the bishop over there in the Lutheran Church, but here in America, the people rule by majority vote. And I would say that in general, after many, many centuries of socializing into a democratic system, most Christians, Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, seem to be perfectly comfortable living in a democracy. They had made their peace with democracy. But the analysis that I offer in the book is that has eroded since the 60s, as many conservative Christians feel alienated from a lot of the social changes since the 60s. Mm. And they feel that culture and politics are dominated by their enemies. So they look at everything from Hollywood to Harvard to the government civil service to the administration of the government or the judges or whoever, especially if the Democrats are in charge, and see the enemy of our values. And so they have this kind of persecution complex.
Oh, yeah.
And fear of oppression or perception of oppression. They're coming after us. They're going to crush us. They're trying to seduce our children into their liberal ways.
Mm-hmm.
And we need somebody who will fight for us. And by the way, that is what Trump promised, and that is one reason why he gained the loyalty of a lot of people in this population in the U.S., because he promised it, and in some ways, he delivered what he promised when he was president.
Yeah. It just happened to not be a democratic process that he delivered upon. Which
like the appointment of the Supreme Court judges was done through a democratic process, though I would say the way that, just to get into the weeds a minute, the way that Mitch McConnell refused to give Barack Obama even a hearing of his nominee in 2016, when he was on the last year of his presidency, that was a violation of democratic norms.
Right.
So anyway, Trump had 3 choices, and they were all passed. And so that was within the democratic process. But what was not was, friends, you're going to have to fight. You're going to have to be strong. Let's march to the Capitol and tell them what's what,
Yeah. So I try to have these conversations with some conservative friends of mine. And they have a lot of the same critique that we're critiquing the right with, but they aim it towards, more of they say left, but I would say centrist, because I don't feel very leftist. I don't feel very, radical leftist or anything. I feel very moderate and centrist. When you look at what we all seem to agree on, I line up with a lot of things of the 80% that we do seem to agree on, but that seems so radical now to conservatives. How would you address someone saying, we don't really have a democracy, we have an oligarchy? Even a Bernie Sanders might say something like that, where we have this elitist 1% that, they have their lobbyists and they're influencing things, and all the power has kind of diverted to the top, and Trump promised to drain the swamp. How would you address that particular argument?
It should be addressed with respect and looked at point by point. In terms of the exercise of government power, here is a plausible critique of Biden, for example. Sometimes executive orders have been used beyond what I think is the proper limit of executive orders. So arguably, the decision simply to cancel student loans, by the president, just saying, it's wiped out, And a couple of times that has been blocked by the Supreme Court, and then he did it again. I think that especially the expenditure of tax dollars constitutionally is in the hands of the legislature. So the overuse of executive orders by any president is something to keep an eye out for. Okay, so there's that, right? I understand why he's doing it, and I'm happy for my friends whose student debts have been wiped out. That's great for them. It would have been nice if it could have been done through the democratic process. When the legislature is paralyzed by partisanship or by inability to get anything done, it creates more of a temptation for the executive to do more than it should.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But more broadly, if you go to the bookstore, you do see a number of right-wing books who say we're living in some kind of socialist / communist / fascist, all the words get thrown around loosely, kind of autocracy. I don't see it. I do see legitimate arguments that can be had related to exactly how the power of the federal bureaucracies are used. Like there was a case that the Supreme Court decided in June related to the civil service being able to write the rules based on relatively loose legislative direction that apply to vast arenas of business activity. So that's in the weeds again, but that's kind of a conservative concern about an over-regulatory state with a lot of power in the hands of the bureaucrats. That can be argued about. Okay, but so there's that. And then there's the issue of, isn't it really the case that the economic elite always dominates? The 1% who have all the money, who can give as much money as they want to a presidential campaign, who seem to have, it always seems to work out for them on Wall Street, right? Those kind of populist economic arguments are to be taken seriously. And one of the things that I think there is now a consensus about is what's good for the bottom line of big business is not always good for local communities, employers, or businesses. So just because you can increase shareholder value by shipping a job overseas, that doesn't mean it's good for Dubuque or Kalamazoo, right? And so checking corporate power when it is indifferent to the employment and communities that people live in, I think that's legitimate. That's a legitimate concern. There's another critique that says, really, the liberal media, the university elites, the liberal legislators, and the bureaucrats are really all on the same team. And so the sense that they're calling the shots and we want to push back against that, there's some truth to that. I've talked to a lot of media. They generally lean center-left. Not always. A lot of national media. And I spend a lot of time around academics, and they generally lean center-left or left, especially in the humanities. So do you notice how I'm attempting to take these concerns very seriously? But this is not the same thing as saying, okay, well, therefore it's okay for us to snip away at the structures of democracy and maybe even attack the Capitol on January 6th. There are things you just don't do. If you want to win an argument, win the argument. If you want more balanced array of journalists, train policymakers, train university professors, train civil servants. And to their credit, a lot of people on the right are attempting to do exactly that.
I can see that. I like how you're differentiating between the personalities and the ideas and then the actual mechanism of democracy. Just these are the rules. This is how it works. And sometimes we lose in this, in this sphere. That's really helpful when we've gotten so personality cult obsessed in our political. It's like identity politics. I identify as left or right or woke or conservative or MAGA or red or blue, we it seems like Trump has inflamed and added gasoline to the fire of these things. Do you think that we're in a different place? It feels a very different place than before 2016. But do you think that he's utterly changed how we do politics and inflamed what was wrong with it? Or do you think that we're just dealing with the same things we've always been dealing with, but a little bit more visible because we're on the internet, there's social media and all that kind of things? What's your opinion there?
Here's one way to say it that would be recognized by the conservatives who might listen to this. It would be that identitarianism, where we mainly think of ourselves in terms of our identities, like Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative, progressive, gay, straight, black, white, Hispanic, or whatever, that identitarianism was, here's the claim, that it was very pronounced on the left for, you might say, since the 60s. And that that what Trump did was to do an identitarian move for conservative, politically conservative or reactionary white people, especially, though not only white, and especially men. So who represents our tribe? Who articulates the concerns of our identity? Our, and then often embattled identity, often critiqued identity. Especially the white straight male, who's often seen and described as the source of many, many problems in society, right? Well, Trump became, you might say, the tribal warlord for the white straight male. And you add the white conservative male, or the white southern male, or the you put enough in there. You know who I'm talking about, right? Mm-hmm. The rural or ex-urban person,
yeah,
who doesn't feel represented by anybody else. And then you add the person who doesn't always say things the way that the university professors expect you to say them now, right? So thus the politically incorrect. Okay, so you add all that, and you have somebody who says, I will represent this tribe. There were some people who attempted to do this earlier on the right. I think it's what George Wallace tried to do in the 60s, especially for the southern white, we're against integration crowd in the 60s, right? It's what Pat Buchanan was trying in the 90s when he ran for president in 1992. But nobody had more success with it. Nobody was able to ride it to the White House, I think, the way that Trump was able to do. It was quite an achievement politically. So I don't blame him for creating identity-oriented politics, but I do think he inflamed them. And partly because he was so in your face about, I'm going to be for this group, and really dismissive, sometimes in crude terms, of other groups, women, people of color, etc. It also inflamed the identity, you might say, the identity concerns on the other side. Well, if he's going to be this way, we're going to double down on our identity claims. And so men versus women, and and so on and so on and so on. In fact, our politics is still, like right now, if you look at polling, the gender breakdown on the Democrats versus the Republicans is quite stark. So we're voting along gender lines, we're voting along racial lines, we're voting along class lines, education lines. And all of that can be very corrosive of, as you said, I'm glad you noted it, of just basic institutions. Who has the time to think about mechanisms of the electoral system, or free and fair votes, or how the judiciary is legitimately or not checking the legislature, when we're all inflamed about our identities and feeling attacked and attacking those bad people over there, right? I would just say, in general, democracy doesn't do well when identity politics comes to dominate the landscape.
Yeah. And Christians don't do well when pluralism starts to take root in a country like ours, where we have immigration, we have people of, multiple religions and races and sexual orientations. We have traditionally not been okay with a pluralistic way. Like, we hold the way. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and we just happen to interpret that through our white Western lens.
Right.
And so we're not comfortable with a pluralism, so therefore we're not comfortable with democracy, I think.
That's essentially what I'm saying. I use the phrase in the book, authoritarian reactionary Christianity, to describe the movement that I'm concerned about. I don't like the term Christian nationalist because it's okay, but I don't think it's as clearly descriptive as what I'm describing. For example, you named right there the discomfort with pluralism of all types: values pluralism, racial pluralism, sexual identity pluralism, ethnic background pluralism, linguistic pluralism, and so I use the term reactionary to describe people who react negatively to pretty much all of that. And they identify Christianity with the way things used to be, better back in the past when we were in charge, when our values prevailed, when we didn't have all these other people here with all their different everything. But what I try to say as a Christian ethicist is, where exactly did we get the idea that Christianity had anything to do with a negative reaction to people being different, to there being diversity? I mean, especially on issues like race, language, nationality. There's nothing in the gospel that's about being opposed to that. In fact, quite the opposite. The movement of the gospel was a movement towards pluralism. It was the building of a multi-ethnic church from all over the Greco-Roman world. A lot of what the New Testament is about is that process of learning how to be that. So this identification of Christianity with a kind of a tribalist whiteness or whatever has nothing to do with Christianity. It's a disaster from a religious perspective.
Yeah, I'm seeing that discomfort in, like, the people who are really entrenched in evangelicalism, where we're very creedal and we're very much trying to convert and convince the masses. We've been handing out tracts and we've been, converting our neighbors, and now we're just taking that mentality and moving into the political sphere, it seems. And now we got to make converts over there.
I argue that it's precisely the obvious failure of every church strategy ever devised to wrestle control of the society back to what we want it to be that has helped to open the door for this authoritarian thing. Like, I remember being taught to evangelize everybody I could. And, what's the success rate? Very small, right? Billy Graham was pretty good at it, but not many of the rest of us were, right? So whether it's evangelism or every other kind of strategy, in one sense, the traditional Christian vision was a vision of triumph for our God based on our various strategies of evangelism and disciple making and missions and all of that. And I mean, you take a group of 20 kids and you send them to an unreached people group, and the goal is to have them be in your group by the end of the trip, right? And when the world doesn't cooperate, and then when the society that you are in doesn't cooperate, and you find yourself losing numerically, losing votes, losing power, losing the argument about values, it's probably inevitable that a certain fear and resentment would jump in there. And if somebody says, don't worry, if you just support me, I will make America great / Christian / the way things used to be again. Just trust me. It's sometimes described as a restorationist politics, as opposed to a transformationist politics. On the left, the story is America is becoming greater because more and more people are having access to the American dream. On the right, unfortunately, the story is America is becoming worse because more and more people are having access to the American dream. More and more people that we don't like, more and more people that are not our people. And by the way, I don't think they can ever win with that message. That's one reason why they keep losing nationally, and why they're losing their children, because children and grandchildren, the younger people, they don't like that message. But the voice of resentment is strong enough to make a real difference in our politics.
Yeah. You kind of lay out some historical patterns of authoritarianism in places like Germany and France and all that kind of things, and you say you kind of boiled it down to a recipe of authoritarianism. Can you share with us that recipe? Like, this is how we get where we are, and maybe the similarities between today and in the past?
It's basically a background of a majority Christian group having dominance of a culture, right? So in Poland it was Catholics, and in Russia it was the Orthodox, and in Germany it was the Lutherans and Catholics, and in France it was Catholic. In the U.S. it was mainly white Protestant, right? And the story that is remembered is our group used to be in charge, and things were better then. Okay, and then gradually over decades, the society pluralizes, liberalizes, modernizes. Christianity, or majority group Christianity, loses power, and more diversity of values and of people grows. And there can be like a tipping point that is reached where this once majority population feels the society slipping away and really gets afraid, feels persecuted, feels angry, can start demonizing the others, and mobilizes for action. If they're in a democracy that's pretty steady, they try to mobilize for action using democratic means first. Religious and then democratic means, as happened in our country. Whether it's religious crusades or evangelistic campaigns or cozying up to a political party and asking the political party to advance its goals. But then if they keep losing, if they keep seeing the society changing in ways that they don't like, then they might be susceptible to a demagogue who says, trust me, I will take this society back. We may have to break a few eggs to get there, but I will take this society back. And I think that it's pretty clear that that is the strategy that has been used by people like Putin in Russia and Orban in Hungary. In the case of Nazi Germany, it was more of a race-based message, not so much religious, though Hitler did strike religious notes. In France, the Catholic Church was very anti-democratic for a long time, and so you had reactionaries of a racial and blood and soil type, but also religious reaction in France. In Brazil, Bolsonaro was able to unite conservative Catholics and evangelicals and Pentecostals for that vision. In Trump, he did the same thing. And the problem is, if the demographic and values trends continue as they usually do, the traditionalist population is going to gradually continue to decline. So there's a moment when they can maybe successfully try an authoritarian project, but if the democracy survives, the right-wing vision loses again and again because the people just don't want it. Not enough of them. I think that's exactly the moment where we find ourselves.
Yeah.
I think that even at this moment, we're recording on August 26th. If you look at the polls, I think Trump is destined to lose again. Maybe. If he does, it'll partly be because that resentful right-wing vision just does not appeal to more than 50% of the population. It just doesn't. And 4 years from now, I think it'll appeal to somewhat fewer, and 4 years after that to somewhat fewer, and 4 years after that to even fewer, because, I don't know, something in the human spirit that I like, that I think is good, that I think God likes, is for more inclusion, and more justice and a welcoming of diversity and a ability to live together with difference, and that more people would be treated with dignity, and that people of different religions would have their consciences respected. What's interesting about that very modern idea is that I think it is written into our constitutional order anyway.
Mm-hmm.
With the Bill of Rights and with religious liberty and freedom of conscience and freedom of speech. That's why I think, one reason why I think that the Democrats will win is because not only does it reflect the values of a modern America, it also reflects the constitutional vision of freedom and respect and tolerance for difference.
Mm. Well, I can definitely feel the energy from the shift from Biden to Harris. There's a definite shift in at least public sentiment that I'm hoping shows up in the polls. Mm-hmm. Now, what do you foresee if Trump does win a second term? How could our country recover afterwards? And what could he do? I guess we'll just leave it at that. How could we recover from what he says he would like to do to the democracy and the rules of the game? How could we recover after that?
It would depend on how many of the rules of the game were weakened and how badly they were weakened. It took Orban 10 or 12 years of continuous power in Hungary to alter the rules of the game sufficiently that he is guaranteed a permanent position as the leader of that country until he decides to step down. Putin has been in power for over 20 years in Russia. It takes a while. I think that significant attacks on the rules of the game, free and fair elections, independent judiciary, that kind of thing, even the principle of like Senate confirmation of cabinet appointments, which if he wants to put in real radicals, he might just not bother with that and just make them recess appointments, and they just, that kind of thing. That's a norm and a rule. With skillful manipulation of his power over 4 years with smart people around him attacking the norms and the rules, he could do considerable damage. I don't know that 4 years would be enough to make our situation like Hungary. 8 years might. 12 years almost certainly would. So would the constitutional order hold? That's the question. Mm-hmm. It held barely in 2020. I'm just pleading with everybody within the reach of my voice to say, let's not test it, please.
Yeah, and that person that says, I don't like him as a person, but I like the gas prices, so I'm going to vote with my wallet and turn off the news. I don't think they have the vision to see what could happen under that second term.
This is my pleading with my fellow Christians and my fellow Americans. Gas prices, inflation, housing, Afghanistan, pullout, immigration, whatever you don't like, they're not as important as the rules of the game being preserved. The constitutional order. And I would also say to the left, people who were going to vote against the Democrats because of, say, Israel-Gaza, very important, not as important as preserving the rules of the game. Because if you don't preserve the rules of the democracy, then you don't get a voice after that. You don't have a democracy. One person decides how everything's going to go.
Yeah. Well, gosh, thank you so much. I think that is just a perfect place to put a kind of a finish line on this. Where would you like to send people to connect with your work and buy your book?
I'd say go to my website, davidpgushee.com,
Mm-hmm.
and everything is pretty much there. I'm on social media at dpgushee. Yeah.
All right. Well, I will put those links down in the show notes so people can just click on them and take them right there just for ease. And gosh, thank you so much for coming on the show, for the work that you're doing to fight for democracy for all people. And I hope that we can have some more conversations in the future and that they're better ones.
I hope so too. That would be great, Tom. Good questions, good conversation, and we'll all be watching. And let's talk again whenever you're ready.
All right. I will definitely do that. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Okay. Take care. Mm-hmm.